Hello, welcome to the Trellis Strategies discussion today. We are very excited to have you join us. It's noon here in Central Texas, so if you're joining us in the Central Time Zone, thank you for spending your lunch hour with us. So my name is Andrea Gonzalez, and I work at Trellis Strategies, and you've joined us today for our webinar on innovations and assessment and credentialing. And I'm very excited to hear from our panelists. I will go ahead and hand it over to our facilitator today, Steve Smith.
Thank you, Andrea, and welcome to everyone who has joined our conversation today. This is going to be a really, really interesting conversation about higher education, where it might go next. And we're going to be talking about the issues of assessment and credentialing as they apply to the future. And we have three experts here to talk about that. I want to introduce first Dr. Jennifer Dirmeyer. Dr. Dirmeyer is the Vice President of Accreditation for the Post-Secondary Commission, an outcomes-based accreditor for post-secondary institution that prioritizes economic mobility, economic returns for students. Prior to joining the Post-Secondary Commission, she founded another organization with similar goals for higher education, the Workforce Talent Educators Association, which is a nonprofit focused on quality in higher education. Dr. Dirmeyer has a PhD in economics from George Mason University, and prior to working in accreditation and quality, she was a professor of economics. Dr. Kenyatta Lovett is with the Education Strategy Group, where he works on ensuring higher education serves as an engine for economic mobility, high-value degrees and credentials that help people get good paying and in-demand careers. He's had a number of positions in public policy that advance this goal. He worked at Educate Texas, focusing on improving outcomes for college access. And prior to that, he was the Assistant Commissioner for Workforce Services at the Tennessee Department of Labor and Workforce Development, where he had similar work helping people with post-secondary attainment and getting the degrees that help them advance their lives. Dr. Lovett has his bachelor's degree from Howard University and his doctoral work from Tennessee State University, where he still teaches classes. Katie Sievers is a partner experience lead at Adept ID, which is a company focused on helping employers match skills to potential employees and help them get productive jobs. Prior to Adept ID, Katie tackles skills and talent challenges within 150 plus enterprise and regional workforces as a lead consultant for Credly, which many of you know provides a digital badge for credentials. She also teaches classes in workforce initiatives, emerging education technologies, and entrepreneurship at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. So we're talking today about a topic of emerging higher education. You know, many of us know that the higher education path is changing and will continue to change as non-traditional, or what we call the modern learner, enters into higher education. Now, who is the modern learner? This is a person who has a very practical end goal in mind. They're not just going to college because it's the next thing to do after high school. They're going to college with a goal. They need to get better skills. They need to advance their career. They are often older students, not always, but often. They are usually working. So in many ways, college is just one of the things they're doing. It's not the only thing that they're doing. We are finding in the work that we're doing that the modern learner is making up more and more and more of the landscape, and their needs are becoming more and more important to what higher education needs to do to provide its program. Now, let's talk about assessment. You know, when you think about college, you think, well, what is it? Why do you go to college? Is it for learning? Well, that's part of it, but you can learn in many ways. You can learn by just doing something. You can learn by reading a book. You can learn by watching videos. Really, college is one step beyond assessment is really what defines the product. In other words, someone giving you feedback on, are you advancing in this skill or not? So really the question is, as we talk about the modern learner, let's talk about assessment. So first of all, I'm going to call on Jen Dirmeyer on this question, which is, tell us a little bit about, where are we, what is the assessment of old? And I know you were a professor, so you had to deal with that. And I'm going to ask Dr. Lovett the same thing, and also Katie, what is the assessment of old? And, in what ways do we need to evolve that old model to deal with these new modern learners who have a different end goal in mind? So what is the assessment of old, first of all? Jen, what is that?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. There, I think are at least half a dozen answers to it that I can think of right now. But the sort of traditional model of higher education is that students enter the institution, they take a series of courses that lead to a degree that has a specific meaning in the marketplace. So, for example, a degree in economics. And to do that, they go through a series of courses, right? And when you're in the course, your faculty member may have designed the entire curriculum, delivers the entire curriculum, and then also designs often the assessments. And what the assessment is meant to do then is to determine whether or not you pass that course. So that's really the core of the old model, or the traditional model of higher education, is that assessments are meant to determine whether or not you get credit for a course. There's not actually a specific connection back to the skill set that students are learning necessarily. In many cases, this isn't what assessments should happen in the course, or what skills someone should learn in the course are not particularly laid out. They're not communicated anywhere. They're not necessarily consistent across courses of the same name, right? And so we have created these little isolated islands called the course. And within that course, the faculty have, of course, the right to determine what is taught, how it's taught, and how it's assessed. And then it's very difficult to communicate it outward. So I would say that the way to characterize that that traditional model is that you really have a lot of faith and trust in the faculty to determine whether or not the assessments are appropriate to indicate the ability to pass the course. No connection to skills. And I think this is really harmful to students. The new model, and I won't take up too much time, but what I would like to see is a movement toward making explicit connections from courses to skills, from assessments to skills, so that we are sort of taking that knowledge of what a student has learned, what a student has attained, what a student has accomplished, and make it transferable outside of the course environment, make it transferable outside of the degree environment, so that that student then has an indicator of what they can do in the world that's not necessarily so insulated into that particular course and that particular degree program. So I would say that movement should be from very contained to the course to something that can move outward and be a part of that student's portfolio going, out into the world.
Okay, fantastic. So the old method, we're going to sit in this class for 16 weeks. The guy who understands it in the first week has got to wait to the end, like the guy who doesn't understand it till week 15. And then you got to have an endpoint called the grade, all right? Or some kind of assessment. So Kenyatta, let me talk to you. Does that method still have value to you? Do we need to disrupt the whole thing? Is there an in-between? What have you done in your own classes, and what have you seen in terms of how to assess real learning outcomes that maybe are different than that old model?
Sure, and I'm a little different from the traditional professor in that I'm more of a practitioner than someone that just stays in the classroom and deals more theoretical with the content. And having said that, I think one thing that was mentioned by our panelist was there's a lack of a feedback loop for that professor to really understand the signals, the data, the information that's relevant, both to the marketplace out there for workforce, but also to the student as well in terms of their long-term outcomes. And what you're asking about the new model and what it could be, I think it's already emerging. And what we've experienced and we're witnessing across multiple states, Texas definitely being one that has inspired a lot, but Colorado as well. We will see in 2025 for sure a strong movement beyond just attainment as 26 states ramp down their attainment goal to attainment and value, because it's the true question is in service to what, and can we truly trust this proxy for skills called the credential or the degree, or do we need more? And so there are multiple states out there right now with policies and bills and even funding like House Bill 8 in Texas, that they've gone beyond just, let's look at just the program, but really, how does this play out for learners? How does this play out for employers? How does this play out for the entire community? This is also impacting enrollment management. So not just in the classroom, but as we start to think about where students are making decisions, they don't want to take the risk that we are used to taking, where it's a 4 to 6 year roll of the dice for a lot of them because of the barriers that they face. They're leaning towards credentials that they know give them the assurances that they can at least get into a career pathway. And all this means is that the new movement is beyond just the faculty member and maybe the department and maybe the college that has some understanding of the broader strokes of industry and in a sector, to something a lot more data driven, a lot more connected to longitudinal data to show exactly how these things play out. This also makes for a much more nimble situation, which is not the norm for faculty members, is to be responsive to changes in the market in real time versus refreshing your syllabi, once every 2 or 3 years. So the transformation, in my opinion, is already taking place. What's happening now is at the state level and also at the policy level, somewhat in the funding level. What we need to see next is how institutions respond to this new framework of evaluating attainment and value.
Okay, fantastic. So really, we're taking assessment as an idea even one step further. Assessment, where we started the conversation is the expert, the teacher assessing the student, but you're also saying that the student now is assessing the school, assessing the program, assessing the whole thing. So Katie, you work with a lot of employers. 2 questions for you. 1, what do they think about the traditional transcript? And 2, how do employers think about, the product and, what the college's assessment means for the student's skill?
Yeah, I think there's no surprise to anyone probably attending this webinar, an increasing pressure on higher ed institutions to prove their value, exactly to Kenyatta's point. And I think what employers are looking for is like authentic ability to demonstrate a skill set. And to go back a little bit to what Jennifer was saying around like the kind of cumulative assessment, it's often, I think, assessing knowledge more than skill. And what I'm thinking of in terms of employers needing to see those skills in practice is, higher education moving more toward application of knowledge and demonstration of ability to use that in an authentic context. What we do at the Graduate School of Education, at least the courses I'm involved with, is often project-based learning. We have, learners who are very, coming in with experience, to your point about who is the modern learner, and they're putting that experience to practice in a context that we're helping to scaffold with some knowledge along the way, but they're getting, iterative feedback on, these kind of components of the work that they're producing over the course of the semester. It's no longer a cumulative, knowledge-based test. It's a kind of assessment mechanism that spans the entire semester and gives them that feedback. And I think, Steve, you mentioned this in your intro, the professors missing the feedback loop, but also the students missing the feedback loop of are they staying on track? You can get all the way through the semester and fail the test and not know where you went wrong. It's a much more agile way of not just, evaluating skills, but also building skills and kind of building awareness of gaps as you go. And I think that agile and kind of, more micro assessment along the way that focuses on how are students demonstrating these abilities in a more authentic way allows the kind of learning process to just kind of exponentially get further along. And I think about kind of like the proficiency kind of levels of going from like novice through, expert. Like they need a chance to practice and fail and kind of try things out. And so the assessment mechanisms that I think are most effective in producing the skills that employers are looking for are the ones that give that recurring feedback loop and that allow the learners to kind of learn through the process of being assessed. At the end of the day, really what employers I think are looking at still is a resume. All of this information gets packaged into a resume. Sometimes, rarely, they'll ask for a transcript. That's probably more likely to be asked for if they're applying for a government or academic job. But the information that they can fit into a couple of pages is what employers are looking at, often using AI screening tools. And so, we know that the kind of majority workforce has tons of, skills that aren't getting packed into the resume. We often call those like off resume qualifications. They might have irregular career paths. They might have partial or in motion education. Employers are only seeing what is put on the page, and that their AI screening tools are actually trained to look for and parse. And that's like a really key kind of breaking point for a lot of majority learners who are coming with all of these rich skill sets developed in their academic programs and beyond, and being seen as employers or by employers just as, whatever makes it out of the parsing system. And so I think what's really exciting to me about the kind of movement in the credentialing landscape is that, yes, giving people credentials that truly represent the full picture of skills and criteria that they kind of had to produce and the evidence of their abilities is super empowering for the learner, gives them the language to use to put on their resume or kind of additional information to append to a CV. And the systems in which employers are already trying to answer the question, where can I find my talent? Those credentials can beef up a resume that can't possibly have all of the potential information about somebody. And so it, in my mind, kind of shifts from, a policy and practice question to a technology one when it comes to reaching employers where they're at, which is like in the HR ATS systems that they're using to find people. So I'll stop there, but happy to dig in more on that front.
Fantastic, Fred. So let me go back to Kenyatta, and then I'm going to go to the issue of, proving that assessment and competency back to Dr. Dirmeyer, to Jen in a second. But Kenyatta, let's go back to the issue of, the learner assessing the college, the employer assessing the college. So how do you, the college, here's the name of my college, here's Steve Smith, here's the degree I offered you. So what can the learner do to go back and say, tell me what I'm going to get for all this tuition? What can the employer do to say to the college, tell me what you did to this person? I mean, is there a way to do that? Are we getting there?
Yes. And in very clear policy language in Colorado, they require annual study to measure return on investment by program. We've seen this also in the University of North Carolina system. We've also seen it in other areas. We've done work in Ohio and also Missouri for similar efforts. And so states are creating more from almost a consumer protection lens, to have transparency to families and to learners to understand what you're actually getting involved with when you decide to major in this at this institution, to know 5 years, 10 years after you earn that degree, your return on investment will be X, Y, or Z. And so I think at the policy level first, that's really hitting a lot of systems of students actually knowing exactly what the wage outcomes look like. It's also starting to trickle down into enrollment management, as I mentioned earlier, where your enrollment issues might be a direct impact of people knowing exactly what those degrees lead to. And I think that's going to be a growing issue for institutions and systems as students become smarter consumers and learners become smarter consumers about the degrees and credentials that they want to earn. For employers, it's the same outcome as well of understanding. And I think they're not really good systems where employers can see that, but I think they're really asking questions of where do we truly source our talent from, and who do we really have the connections with? And so things like work-based learning and apprenticeships and other things create a stronger connection. But if you're an institution that doesn't have that, and definitely employers are starting to ask that question of, where are we sourcing our talent from, and then why don't we make more investments there versus investments spread out across an entire region. And so these things are coming out and play in very interesting ways. And again, back to the transparency that the states are requiring for institutions and systems to provide. This is also information that employers can look at as well and know the value of one degree versus another within their own region. And so more data, more transparency, more outcomes that are being shown, I think leads to a little bit more accountability for higher education.
One more question, Kenyatta. Is the enrollment management decision the same for an 18-year-old as the same for the 25-year-old, or is it different?
It's different. And what I like about what they're thinking about in House Bill 8, at least David Troutman and at the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board, when we think about return on investment, it looks totally different for an 18-year-old who doesn't have you're going to assume the wages that they would earn. But if you're an adult, you already have those wages. And so the foregone wages to go to college are going to play out a lot different in the ROI metric than it would for a traditional age student. So they definitely are different, but also those stories need to be told to really show how institutions and systems are really serving the modern learner, which I love that term, by the way.
Fantastic. So Jen, I know you have worked tremendously on this next issue that I'm going to ask about, and you're still working on it, and that is competency-based assessment. In other words, so we talked, Katie was talking about, employers looking at more of an iterative assessment, not just a kind of a one and done type of thing or whatever. So let's talk about competency-based assessment. What is it? And then I also want to ask you about time. I mean, do we still need the time-based system that we have today, or is that also something that really is we're evolving away from as we start a different type of assessment? So first of all, what is competency-based assessment, and how does it relate to time specifically in the way we do colleges today?
Let me just ask a quick clarifying question. So by time, you mean like semester-based credit or clock hours, or is that what we?
Yeah. So I guess I'm saying to yourself, you know what? Why do I have to sit through 16 weeks of this when I'm done after one?
Okay.
You gave me the competency. I have it. Let me move on with my life. And why do I have to pay 16 weeks of tuition?
Yeah, so I think of that second question is more of like a differentiated learning paths question rather than like like time or not time. But I will start to talk a little bit about competency-based education and competency-based assessment, and what it is that we should be trying to accomplish with this. So I think of this actually as I think of this as competency-based assessment writ large. So there's a very specific educational technique, competency-based education, with specific assessment types and types of learning and types of delivering knowledge. And I'm not really talking about that one specific technical term. The thing that I am interested in is connecting learning experiences, assessment, and skills. In particular, skills in such a way that we can communicate outward what skills someone has attained, right? Like that's where the power comes for the students. If they can actually identify, here are the skills that I have learned, here's the skills I have demonstrated mastery in, demonstrate a real mastery in the skill, they can communicate that to employers. They can use that to leverage, opportunities in the future. So I really think about education as a way to validate skill attainment, right? So as opposed to thinking about it in that narrow competency-based education, which I'm a fan of as well. But I think you can think about validating skill attainment in a broader sense, right? It can be within a 16-week course. It could be within a more asymmetric, asynchronous learn as you go situation. Both of those can have validated skill attainment. So I don't think there's any one particular model. I think that we have sort of crammed ourselves into one model, right, with some small variations right now. And I think that that's primarily because we don't have what Kenyatta was talking about. We don't have that focus on ROI. We don't have that focus on impact. What Katie was talking about, we don't have that focus on ensuring that employers actually are valuing what students can have coming out. And so I was at a I wouldn't say very traditional. I was at a public college, public university in Michigan when I was a professor, and it's a fantastic school. We thought of ourselves as an opportunity school, as a place where people who maybe would not have traditionally gone through a traditional higher ed process would go, very focused on work, had a really neat mix of degrees, like very traditional degrees, and then some like HVAC management, which was cool. Like a mix of interesting degrees, had associate's degrees, bachelor's degrees, master's, and doctorate degrees. So it had, a wide range, and it was a place that many people could see themselves succeeding. One of the things that I noticed, and the reason I left academia, I was tenured, and I left that position because I realized that all of our efforts at the institution to make sure that students were prepared for work, there was no mechanism, and I'm an economist, so you'll have to forgive me, but there was no mechanism for a return on any of that investment by the institution, right? So there was we had built an unsustainable system. If you did a great job of getting your students to work, there were no reputational mechanisms that would lead students there. It wasn't in the rankings at this time. Like, we've made quite a lot of improvements, but still, like, the success of your students post-graduation was not even a factor in the rankings that students use to determine what school they go to, right? The state funding, not a factor, whether or not your students were successful post-graduation. Accreditation, not a factor, right? All of the major avenues which schools use to bring in funds to be able to deliver the education, none of them had any concern whatsoever about whether or not your students were succeeding post-graduation. So what we had done was we had created a situation where we were telling institutions, you have to align to the workforce. You have to make sure that your students are prepared, and then given absolutely no incentive or reward or support or structure to do that, right? So the things that we hear about from both of our other panelists today, like, these are amazing things that we are starting to get some of that statewide support for schools to be concerned about the returns on education. When you have that in place, then the next logical step is the things that Katie is talking about. It's like, oh, okay, let's think about aligning with employers, because now there's a system built that supports institutions, that empowers institutions to care about whether or not their students are successful post-graduation. You can't just demand it. You have to make sure that the system supports that, right? And so I think we are starting to see that future come, where schools are getting more serious about being able to validate skills, right? Because we have that system that's set up to encourage it, we are starting to see more schools interested in validating skills. And what does that mean? It means being transparent about the specific learning outcomes that are often now skills-based for a course, right? It means experimenting with new models where you are able to sort of take a more asynchronous approach, demonstrate your skill, move on to another section of the course. It's not necessarily going to be the same model for everyone, but the end goal of the model should be to validate skills so that the institution can demonstrate what its students can do to employers. And then that closes the loop, right? Then students have the power to go on and get great jobs, and then they have the ROI. You need every portion of that. You need the skills validation, you need the employer information, you need the state and infrastructure support to be able to sort of create that, I would say not one model, like a whole variety of models that allow students to really demonstrate their skill, allow skill validation at the institution level. So I think it's extremely important.
Well, and I'm understanding you, Jen, you may correct me if I'm wrong, that this validation you're talking about is kind of content neutral. So let me test that theory. So let's say I go to school to be an electrician. Well, there's a pretty good way to tell whether I learned the material I pass or don't pass the electrician test. I've got a bachelor's degree in economics. We don't have that level of thing, right? And you're saying that validation can exist for both.
Totally. Yeah, I will tell you what. So when I was teaching economics, I will say skill validation at the very intro level, we are mostly still in knowledge validation there. Just making sure people understand the concepts, making sure that they're able to like correctly identify the various elements. But then the minute you move past that, you're immediately into production decisions. You're into predicting the impact of certain government behaviors on interest rates, right? These are actually practical things that people use in the world, right? So you can very quickly get to specific skills that you want your students to have. And then you can also think about non-practical skills. Like people often talk about critical thinking, which I have a little bit of a distaste to thinking of that as one thing. I think it's very context specific, but you can have communication skills, you can have critical thinking and analysis skills that you specifically target in a program and that you can validate your students having, right? So it really is content neutral. It's about an attitude toward what the assessment is doing, and then making sure that the institution has sort of structured all of their courses to make sure that the students in a particular course are getting those particular skill sets, right? So like making sure there's some regularity, but yeah, it goes everywhere.
Okay. So, I've got my certificate in electricity, or I've got my bachelor's degree in economics. There is a way to validate, but Katie, let me ask you this question. I just mentioned two traditional outcomes: certificate, associate's degree, bachelor degree. Let's talk about the big credential and the small credential. Do employers care about that? Does bachelor degree mean something more than XYZ other credential means? Are we living in the past with these old names, or does this still matter?
There is such a long tail of credentials, like non-degree or alternative credentials out there, that there was just some research put out by Northeastern around like employers' perceptions or hiring managers' perceptions of non-degree credentials. And for the most part, folks still don't know how to understand one from another. They understand that the data from Northeastern showed that, hiring managers are seeing it as maybe a signal of kind of interest or learning agility to supplement a degree, but overall aren't making hiring decisions on the basis of these kind of long tail of non-degree credentials. That script flips a little bit when you're talking about those qualifying credentials, or like those certifications, what I call like big C certifications, the legally defensible ones that folks like are, passing to become an electrician or a nurse, or, any other kind of trade route. Those are industry recognized credentials that employers are explicitly asking for. And I call them qualifying credentials because if you don't have it, you can't, it's like a license or whatever other term, specific fields are using. You can't get the job unless you have that qualification. So that's slightly different. And I think higher ed institutions are starting to recognize the power in those industry recognized credentials, especially around community colleges who are embedding those certifications into a degree or an associate's or bachelor's path. And so I think recognition that, firstly, many employers are moving away from the degree as a proxy or the degree requirement in general, and they're starting to get more explicit around specific credentials that are is valuable for a particular role or qualifying for a particular role, or just being more expressive of the competencies that they need in a particular job. And so, the degree is actually not a filter anymore that most folks are, many folks are using. I shouldn't say most. But what we're seeing still happening is even if they drop the degree requirement, the hiring decisions aren't changing. Like there was a great paper put out by Harvard Project on Workforce and I think it was Burning Glass Institute around the impact of dropping the degree requirement and taking a skills first or skills based approach. it's happening in words less or more than it's happening in practice. And so that said, they're dropping the degree requirement, but they don't have another fallback. Like they don't have another way of like vetting the talent that's coming through the pipeline. And so there is still a human kind of implicit reliance on the old mechanisms of looking for the degree in the resume. And so I think without kind of an understanding of, and I don't think it's fair to like put the onus on a hiring manager to like understand the long tail of the credentials. That's crazy. Like we're credentialing experts here, and I don't think any one of us knows the full picture of the hundreds of thousands of credentials that are out there. I think there needs to be more work done on the, and again, I'll come back to the technology side and then I'll take myself out of it, but on kind of unpacking the information that is like within those credentials. So that's a lot of the work that, for example, Credly does, and my former employer who, has the digital credentialing platform allows people to kind of give the digital proof of that skill, but also my current employer, Adept ID, does the work of like inferring the skills that people might have on the basis of credentials they've earned or job titles they've had, and using that to like help the employers make better decisions. And it's still a human kind of process. And so the fact that, through these new models and giving people industry recognized credentials, giving people more regular feedback through the competency-based education processes and assessment mechanisms, we're really enabling learners to tell that story more confidently. And I've kind of always been a big believer that in this kind of like three-part ecosystem of credential value, where we have the learner, the employer, and the credential issuer all in different parts of the pyramid, like a big part of the value proposition of issuing a credential to someone is for the learner, like that motivational and identity kind of like oomph that comes from having your skills and your abilities like in front of you, and the like kind of empowering language that then you can take with you. I don't think that that's necessarily reliant on employers fully understanding or recognizing the credential as well. I think it just empowers the learner to tell that story more confidently, which is a net win. On the other side of the house, the issuer needs to have, the higher ed institutions or the kind of alternative training providers need to have full awareness of the language that's going to resonate with employers, so that they're equipping the learners with the right words that are going to really kind of hit the nail on the head when they're sitting down in front of that interview and answering that question. Tell me about a time when, you demonstrated X skill. And I think there's a lot of really great work happening to kind of put the employer at the center. The talent pipeline management program that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation runs is an example of this, where they really put the employers in a room together and they say, let's talk about what our skills needs are going to be in the next, 2-4 years. Let's talk about like coming to agreement around definition of those skills within an industry. Let's give that information to the education institutions or the training providers so that we know we can trust the talent they're producing. And it's kind of an authentically like employer-driven conversation that then trickles down to what's being taught, what's being assessed, and what's being validated in the credential, which helps the learner communicate how they kind of meet that demand. So that was
You think it's fair to say, though, that traditional higher ed, let me talk about, traditional college, university, still has a lot of hard work to do to articulate to the employers, this is what you're seeing from us. Because you're saying, we take away the degree, the formal degree, but we're still not exactly sure. It leaves a little bit of a vacuum of understanding here. Do we still, does higher education owe that, or is it someone else, or is this higher education's already, they're out of that picture already? I
think we'd all agree that higher ed has a lot of work to do on that front. I think most training providers do. I think it's going to be kind of an existential question at some point, especially as more of these policies get put in place that rely on, that universities rely on funding that then will demand they have answers to these questions. Like they'll have to figure it out. So I love that point, and I love that, Jen, you kind of took action with your own power and time spent, that you're willing to tackle that problem head on.
Right. Well, I'm number 34 in the rankings just isn't good enough, right, for this answering this question. Okay, so Kenyatta, I know you've done some work in this area, or you've dealt with this issue, and I'm going to talk about, you know, who is in this conversation. So, remarkably enough, some of the issues we're talking about here, which is elevating the need for education to be skill aligned and everything, is really somewhat apolitical. A lot of people kind of agree with this issue, but the controlling interest or the gatekeeper has been the traditional higher education ecosphere, the U.S. Department of Education, state departments of education, yet other entities are putting money into this now. Maybe they're providing funding for learning, or they're providing voice about learning. So the real question is it just chaos to let all these others in? How do we create some kind of a dialogue that includes people that are outside the traditional, the accreditors, the higher ed, the state departments that make up the ecosphere that we know today? Can we let these others in?
Oh, absolutely. And I think the rallying cry is around economic mobility. That then puts the credential, the degree in a different context than it being the be all and end all of what a student needs to earn to be successful out there in life. And so you brought up a really good point. We see more and more now workforce agencies are leaning into this conversation along with higher education in K through 12. We lead a 6-state cohort of states that are looking at credit mobility and non-credit mobility, where they're creating skills taxonomies to make sure that all the different levels of non-credit have some level of portability for learners to be able to advance in this work. But it's mainly coming out of not just higher education, but also workforce development and to some degree even economic development. You mentioned philanthropy. Again, economic mobility is a rallying cry for them as well. And so their investments go anywhere from investing in the understanding social capital, because it's more than just earning that degree. It's what happens when you have a work-based learning experience, or what happens when you have exposure and networks that can strengthen your ability to be more mobile out there in the marketplace, all the way to more sector-based strategies where they realize pathways are very important for learners to get through a system. And we're leading an 8-state electric vehicle cohort of basically the governors and the workforce agency leads at the state level signed a compact to create better pathways in electric vehicle industry pathways for learners of all types. And so all of that meant that philanthropy wanted to come in and cultivate that and create that connective tissue so that these 8 states could grapple and figure out with employers what are some of these overarching credentials, the skills that are needed, what are the data systems that are needed for 8 states to play together and employers to play together to make sure they have a much more robust and healthy pipeline of talent. And then to that point, economic development, when you think about, if you all remember Amazon, when they came and had a bid for who was going to get the next location, this was years ago, and everyone, even small towns, put in a pitch for their town to get the Amazon site. It was a massive number of jobs that most wouldn't qualify for, and we thought that was going to be the end of it. Well, we come now to the CHIPS Act and other types of big federal investments, and we have massive, major economic development activities that are requiring tens of thousands of workers with different skill sets that one institution alone can't solve. That means it needs to be in a regional effort to make sure you have that talent coming in locally, not necessarily importing talent. And so you mentioned an ecosystem that's in this space now. Yes, it requires many more voices, many more actors, many more stakeholders to be part of this conversation. The last thing I'll say is, while states also have they're building their sort of frameworks for attainment and value, we also see things like the Carnegie rankings and other types of national rankings now that are leaning into this as well. So I think this is more of an all-in effort, but the rallying cry, in my opinion, is around economic mobility.
Now, it sounds like you were mentioning some of these, maybe I'm going to call them newer actors into the higher ed ecosphere. And when it comes to assessment, it sounds like they may not even be talking about it the same way. what are people learning? How do you validate it? So go back to electric vehicles. I don't know how you assess whether someone is qualified to do that work, but I can imagine in a traditional hire, you have this calculus class you have to take. That's one way we validate you can do this work. You have to take this engineering class. That's the way we validate it. Some of these newer actors may not even be thinking about it in those ways at all. I'm not really sure. Have you confronted that at all?
Yeah, they're thinking about it and they struggle with how do you create the right framework. So, Katie, you brought it up. Well, it's the student, it's the employer, it's the educational provider that's there. But the real question, and I'll go back to this electric vehicle collaborative, they want to have one credential that aligns to portability for the learner or the worker, so that if you're working at Mercedes-Benz in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and you somehow move over to BMW in South Carolina, that credential gives you that portability. And they're grappling with, what's the right credit or credential issuer? How do you make this portable? How do we create the skills taxonomy? Who owns it, right? And I think that's the question you're asking. But I think we're starting to get that built in different ways. And I wonder if it's going to be sector by sector, or if it's going to be state by state, or if it's going to be region by region. But I think a lot of those elements are starting to come into play, and it's really around economic mobility.
Interesting, very interesting. So let's go to our audience. So please send your question in through either Q&A or chat. We can look at it both. So here's a question. What role does self-assessment play in competency-based education, and how can we ensure students feel empowered to assess their own skills and learning? Jen, I'm going to turn that to you. So self-assessment and competency-based, are students, is that even a thing? Is self-assessment a thing, or that's what I'm paying tuition for the expert to assess me?
Yeah, that's fun. So I think anyone that has tried to learn something outside of a traditional space is very familiar with the concept of self-assessment. As a matter of fact, I get frustrated with the assessments that come in non-traditional. I'm like, I'm just going to go and try and do this thing on my own, and then we'll see how much I know and what I still need to learn, right? So I think that self-assessment plays a huge role in learning, right? And so if you've set up the credentialing process correctly, that should be maximizing learning, right? And so the way I think of this is that we probably don't need to, instructors can always be helpful in sort of teaching people how to self-assess. A lot of that does come naturally, but they can always be helpful in it. I think that if you get the incentives right on the other side, so if you say, okay, your goal as a learner, is to develop the skill and then be able to demonstrate it so that it can be validated externally. If you know that is your role, then it's absolutely natural for the student to be involved in a self-assessment process, right? It's absolutely natural for the instructor to sort of give people some hints and some clues on how to go about doing self-assessment. So if we've got the goal of learning right, and we have the credentialing process, and we have that assessment validation set up so that it is not like my job is to please the professor, right? It's set up instead, my job is to demonstrate this skill. Then I think that self-assessment and talking about self-assessment is just quite a natural part of it. The only reason that wouldn't be natural is if we're not really talking about assessing skills and validating skill competencies, right? But instead we're talking about pleasing a particular human who's holds your future in their hands, right?
So I will agree with that. I was the president of a culinary school, and the first question we would ask the student is, would you buy this food that you just cooked? And if they say no, well, then the teacher needs to tell them how you can get it up to that level. But yeah, you have to say, would you pay for this food? Yeah, yes or no. So let's talk about this one. We're discussing at one of the institutions I serve how to categorize non-degree educational attainment like certificates and using big C and little c. Seems confusing within institutions, let alone marketing them to potential learners. How are other institutions marketing big C certificates versus little c that improves consumer transparency about their utility? Katie, this one is made for you because I know you deal with this issue. What is the answer to this question?
Yeah, it's a great question. And The kind of big C, little c is more of my own shorthand when I'm talking about certificates and certifications as being different things, because the words sound so similar. So I appreciate this being brought up. I think the kind of big C certifications are the industry recognized certifications. Often licenses, I think about the kind of trades, which have oftentimes an industry recognized credential. It's about like, what are employers actually asking for in order for people to access those specific jobs? And so oftentimes the communication around the certifications is you'll graduate not just with an associate's or whatever it is, but you'll also graduate, equipped to qualify for one of these certifications, which is exactly what your potential future employer is going to be asking for. It's a direct pipeline into a job. And so the kind of nuance there is that certifications are often earned by passing a, third-party assessment, which is, very kind of robustly and securely delivered. And it's separate, like kind of definitionally detached from the learning piece. So that the kind of degree granting institution might be training people to equip them to pass that assessment, but they actually have to the assessment is taken through a different channel. And so the institution, like the higher ed institution, may not be the actual awarder of the certification. So when it comes to marketing it, it's about preparing you to kind of earn those certifications, preparing you to successfully kind of catapult your career in that direction. The certificates are really useful to kind of categorize a bundle of learning opportunities around a particular domain. For example, I see a lot of these around, data analytics certificates, or you see, coding certificates or boot camps. The certificates are the kind of building the competencies and recognizing the kind of domain readiness, rather than being something that employers are explicitly asking for. I'd welcome Jen and Kenyatta's perspective on that as well.
Yeah, I definitely on the certifications, that part of it, it's almost a chicken and egg question. If I need the certification, then what is the degree for, and why can't the certification be part of the degree requirement? And I think that's a new conversation that's coming out, that institutions that figure that out and market that, I think, will be ahead of the curve versus the others who realize that there are some inequities when sometimes students will earn that degree but not even get close to passing that certification, whether it's cost or time or whatever it may be. Embedding that actually is an equity imperative. And for the small C sort of certificates, I think most institutions are behind the curve, or not as advanced as they should be in marketing that. When students are obviously going for these, and more, the volume is increasing more for students to be attracted to these types of certifications. So to embed these within programs or stack them within programs, I think is a value add for anyone that wants to do that as an institution. What I have seen is North Texas, actually during the COVID-19 pandemic, when there were Google certifications, actually would have grant 13 credit hours for those certifications. And I thought that was one of the more genius marketing and recruitment and enrollment strategies, is to say, we're going to take these certifications or certificates and use this as a part of a credit mobility strategy. But again, not many institutions or systems out there are leveraging this in a way, and that's resonating with learners and also resonating with employers, is that if you can embed these things with the degree, you've got a lot more value to the learner out there in the marketplace.
If I might just quickly tie together Kenyatta's great perspective there with the first question around self-assessment, self-evaluation. I also wonder if when we're thinking about different types of credentials, we might also think about different ways of kind of proving that you have a competency. And the important thing at the end of the day is that employers trust that signal regardless of where it's coming from. And so when I think about certifications are kind of qualifying credentials. There's lots of ways to build those skill sets. A lot of times there's like boot camps to prepare you. There's, self-guided learning, which are, more and more commonly sought out. And, all of those things leads to, again, somebody writing that they have a particular set of skills on their resume. Anytime you write something on your resume, that is self-assertion. And so I think a lot of those things are kind of tied together in this like broader picture of like, what are all of the different ways that people are building, proving, validating skills. And I think just having a way of ensuring that kind of crosswalking can happen. I think it was Kenyatta that mentioned the idea of kind of skill standards and frameworks. The only way that all of those things can kind of become portable is if we align kind of on a common understanding of what a particular skill or competency means in a particular context. And I think a lot of that work is being done at like the industry or regional level right now. And that's kind of the ACE credit concept of, saying the Google certifications are worth X number of credits. Same concept, like we're kind of aligning on a similar language that we can agree applies across contexts. And so I think a lot about how do we increase transparency of how skills are defined and evaluated for people who want to be able to say, I have that thing, I have that skill, competency, whatever it is. And Education Design Lab is one example of an organization that's doing some great work around this. They, have the durable skills that are, aligned with industry demand. They have very robust skill kind of definitions, frameworks, and they're building out through the skills validation network, lots of different ways of proving that you have each of those skills. And so it might be looking at like gig workers' records of all of the things that they've done as an Uber driver or whatever, and saying, what can we understand about this person's durable skills based on the behaviors they're already demonstrating? They've already demonstrated, and they have that evidence in the kind of gig app that they're using to apply their skills. How can we empower people to have evidence of what they're able to do through multiple channels? And a lot of that, I think, relies on being able to kind of crosswalk a lot of those kind of skill standards. So I just wanted to kind of draw that connection.
Fantastic. So we have got 2 minutes left, and I'm going to introduce one more provocative question. I'll start with Kenyatta and see if anyone else has any issue. Because Kenyatta, I know you dealt with this from your position working with a number of states, which have a goal of let's get people working, let's draw industry to our state, let's have productive, happy lives through earning a living wage, et cetera. So the real question, though, we've been talking about school, we've been talking about credential, we've been talking about workplace, and this question, there's no distinction between learning and places of employment. How do we embed workplace skills, learning, into curriculum practice to effectively train students for their employment? I think employers and academic institutions need to collaborate on assessment and evaluation. One cannot have the whole vision without involving the other. So Kenyatta, I'll start with you. And then in the 2 minutes we have left, anyone else wants to join in? Kenyatta, what are your thoughts?
I totally agree. And the one example I'll give of the flaw in the system is when I think about medics that serve in the military and have done multiple tours of duty that have to start all back over for earning a degree or a credential. And probably that student, that learner probably could teach the class. And so totally spot on that it should be a more holistic approach to curriculum development and much more in real time to make sure that those skills are current to what employers need.
Great example. Jen, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, I'm actually going to take this opportunity to tie in something that Katie said in her last answer. All of this goal of credentialing, to make it powerful for the learner, is actually to create something that employers can trust, right? So I think that the idea of creating with employers in mind the learning opportunities, the assessment opportunities, it's essential to do that. And I think that the other element of it is actually third-party validation. So the big difference between little c and big C is actually the third-party validation. It's not like the institution itself is telling you. There's an outside source. So I do think it's like employer-focused, and then something employers can trust usually involves third-party validation that employers trust.
Fantastic. Katie, any thoughts you have on this?
I'll cede my response for the minute we have left. Just double clicking on what they've said.
Fantastic. Okay, fantastic. Thank you, everyone, for joining this conversation today. It's a really big question. I don't think it's over yet, but we're starting to make strides in this big conversation. So our thanks today to our expert and very insightful panelists, Jennifer Dirmeyer, Kenyatta Lovett, and Katie Sievers. Thank you so much. We have more webinars and more content coming up in the future, so make sure you check us out at our website, trellisstrategies.org. Thank you very much to our panelists, and thank you for our participants for joining us today. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.